2 minutes ago, Iranian missiles struck Israel's national water infrastructure. Not a military base, not a radar installation, not an airport. The water. The Mekorot National Water Company facilities that supply drinking water to 4 million people in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area have been struck. The pumping stations are not operational. The desalination infrastructure that produces the majority of Israel's domestic fresh water supply has sustained direct impact. The pipeline network that moves that water from production facilities to the 4 million taps, the 4 million glasses, the 4 million families that depend on it every single day is no longer functioning. And the Israeli government has not told those 4 million people. Not a warning, not guidance on how long the outage will last, not instructions on what to do when the tap runs dry, nothing. The silence that has followed every defensive failure in this conflict, the interceptor silence, the Dimona silence, the warhead silence, the airport silence, has now extended to the most basic human necessity that a government is supposed to guarantee its civilian population: water. 4 million people in Israel's largest metropolitan area woke up this morning inside a conflict that has struck their airports, their nuclear facilities, their military bases, and their cities. They're going to turn on their taps today, and nothing is going to come out. And their government knew that before they did, and said nothing. That silence is not operational security. That silence is a government that has run out of ways to describe what is happening to its country and has chosen to let its civilian population discover the consequences themselves rather than prepare them for what is coming. In the next few minutes, I will show you exactly what Iran struck, why the water infrastructure was the most strategically intimate target Iran has hit in this entire conflict, what the Mekorot facilities represent in terms of Israel's civilian survival infrastructure, what 4 million people without access to clean drinking water means in the context of a country already under sustained ballistic missile bombardment, and why the water supply strike is the moment this conflict stopped being about military capability and started being about whether Israeli civilian society can continue to function. Before we get into it, thanks for watching. Your support is what keeps this going, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you here. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so more people can follow this. Now let's get into it. To understand why the water supply strike is categorically different from every other infrastructure strike Iran has conducted in this conflict, you need to understand what Mekorot actually is, and why its continued operation is not a civilian convenience, but a biological necessity for the population it serves. Mekorot National Water Company is the state-owned utility that operates approximately 90% of Israel's national water infrastructure. It manages the desalination plants along Israel's Mediterranean coastline that produce the majority of the country's fresh water from seawater. It operates the pumping stations that pressurize the national water carrier network. It manages the storage reservoirs that provide the buffer capacity between production and consumption that keeps water flowing to taps during the gaps between production cycles. And it maintains the pipeline grid that physically moves water from production and storage to the 4 million residential and commercial connections in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area alone. The facilities Iran struck this morning were not peripheral nodes in that network. They were primary production and distribution infrastructure, whose removal from the operational picture does not reduce water supply. It eliminates it. The desalination plants that were struck produce water that has no alternative domestic source at equivalent volume. Israel is a water-scarce country that solved its water scarcity problem through a combination of desalination technology and network infrastructure that took decades and billions of dollars to build. The natural water sources, the aquifers, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River tributaries, do not produce sufficient volume to supply the current population without the desalination contribution. When the desalination infrastructure goes down, the natural sources do not compensate. The gap between what the natural sources produce and what 4 million people in Tel Aviv require daily is a gap that bottled water, emergency distribution, and improvised collection cannot fill at the volume and the speed the situation demands. That is the water situation that 4 million people in Israel's largest metropolitan area are waking up into this morning. Not a reduced supply, not a rationing situation where the government manages a constrained but functioning distribution system. No supply. The taps will run dry as the residual water in the distribution network is consumed. That process takes hours, not days. And the government has not told the 4 million people whose taps are running dry right now that what is happening to their water supply this morning is not a temporary technical fault that will be resolved before dinner. Now let us talk about what 4 million people without access to clean drinking water means in practical terms, because the abstraction of an infrastructure strike needs to be translated into the human reality it produces to be fully understood. A human being requires approximately 2 to 3 liters of drinking water per day to maintain basic physiological function. 4 million people require 8 to 12 million liters of drinking water per day at that minimum threshold. That number does not include the water required for sanitation, It does not include the water required for food preparation. It does not include the water required for the hospitals that are already operating at surge capacity, managing casualties from the sustained ballistic missile campaign. It does not include the water required for the fire services that are responding to the fires that the hypersonic missile barrages have been setting across Tel Aviv's districts. The minimum drinking water requirement alone for 4 million people is a logistics challenge that no emergency distribution system, no matter how well prepared, can meet at scale in the immediate aftermath of a water infrastructure strike. The bottled water reserves in Israeli supermarkets and emergency stockpiles will be consumed within hours of the population understanding what has happened to the water supply. The emergency water trucking capacity that Israel's civil defense infrastructure maintains is designed to supplement a constrained supply, not to replace a completely absent one. And the population of 4 million people that is going to begin competing for whatever bottled and distributed water is available. The moment the tap runs dry is not a population that has been warned, prepared, or given guidance about how to manage the transition from functioning tap water to an emergency distribution situation. Because the government has said nothing. The hospitals are the dimension of the water supply strike that deserves specific analytical attention because it is the most immediately life-threatening consequence of the infrastructure loss, and the one that the government's silence is most directly endangering. Israel's hospitals have been operating under sustained pressure throughout this conflict. They are receiving casualties from the missile campaign. They are managing the medical consequences of a civilian population living under sustained ballistic missile bombardment, and they depend on water, not as a convenience, as a clinical necessity. Surgical procedures require sterile water. Wound treatment requires water. Dialysis patients require water at a volume and a purity standard that emergency distribution cannot provide on the timeline that dialysis requires. The hospital system that was already operating at the edge of its capacity before the water supply strike is now operating without the water infrastructure its clinical functions depend on. The Israeli government knows which hospitals are affected. It knows which clinical functions are at immediate risk. It knows which patient populations, the dialysis patients, the surgical patients, the intensive care patients, face life-threatening consequences from a water supply interruption, measured in hours rather than days. And it has not communicated that information to the hospitals, to the medical staff, or to the patients and their families who need it to make immediate decisions about care. That silence is not the silence of a government managing operational security. It is the silence of a government that has no answer for what is happening and has chosen silence over the admission that it does not have one. Iran's strategic calculation behind the water supply strike is the dimension of this story that reveals the most about how Iran has been thinking about this conflict's endpoint and what it calculated the water strike would achieve beyond the immediate infrastructure damage. Every previous strike in this conflict targeted infrastructure whose loss degraded Israel's military capability or its government's operational continuity. Radar installations degraded the defensive architecture. Interceptor stockpile attrition reduced the protective coverage. Ben Gurion's closure severed the logistics and evacuation pipeline. The American base strikes removed the external support architecture. Each of those targets was military or strategic in the way that military analysts measure strategic value. The water supply is different. The water supply is not a military target in that analytical sense. It is a civilian survival target. Striking it does not degrade Israel's ability to fire missiles or intercept incoming rounds. It degrades Israel's civilian population's ability to maintain the basic biological functions that human life requires. That distinction matters because it tells you what Iran calculated this strike would achieve that the previous strikes had not. The previous strikes produced military consequences and political pressure. The water supply strike produces a civilian population that is thirsty, not metaphorically pressured, not strategically disadvantaged, thirsty. 4 million people whose most basic physical need is not being met and whose government has not told them when it will be met again. The political consequences of that condition for a government that has been managing this conflict's domestic narrative for weeks are consequences that no communication strategy can manage. Because you cannot frame a water outage. You cannot provide context for empty taps. You cannot explain to a parent why their child cannot have a glass of water in a way that the parent will find adequate. The water supply strike is Iran's most politically precise action of this entire conflict because it produces a civilian consequence that is universally understood, immediately personal, and completely impossible for the government to manage through the narrative tools it has been deploying throughout the preceding weeks. The Netanyahu government's political position following the water supply strike is the most untenable it has been since February 28th, the corruption trial, the rejected pardon, the American withdrawal, the Ben Gurion closure, the Dimona strikes, the hypersonic barrage that set Tel Aviv on fire, and now 4 million people in Israel's largest city with nothing to drink. Each of those events added to the accumulated political weight pressing down on a government that started this conflict with a promise of quick and decisive action. The water supply strike is different from all of them in the specific way that makes it the hardest single event yet to survive politically. Every previous failure was a failure of military or strategic infrastructure. This is a failure of the most basic obligation a government holds toward its civilian population. The obligation to ensure that the people it governs have water to drink. That obligation is not strategic. It is not military. It is not subject to the analytical framing that has allowed the government to manage every previous failure within a narrative of difficult choices made under extraordinary circumstances. It is the obligation that every Israeli parent, every Israeli child, every Israeli family turning on a dry tap this morning will measure their government against. And the government has already failed it. The international response to the water supply strike is producing reactions across multiple capitals that are being driven not by strategic calculation, but by the humanitarian dimension of 4 million people losing access to drinking water in a conflict zone. The International Committee of the Red Cross has issued a statement identifying the water infrastructure strike as a potential violation of international humanitarian law prohibiting attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival. Israel's allies, who have been managing their public support for the conflict within the framework of Israel's right to defend itself, are now managing a domestic public opinion environment in which the images and accounts coming out of Tel Aviv are not images of military strikes on military infrastructure. They are accounts of people with nothing to drink. That shift in the human story of this conflict from military infrastructure failure to civilian survival failure is the shift that changes the international political environment in ways that military strikes on military targets do not. The open question that the water supply strike leaves hanging over this conflict and over the Israeli government that has gone silent about it is the one that has no strategic answer. At what point does a civilian population that has watched its airports closed, its nuclear facilities struck, its largest city set on fire, and its water supply destroyed, decide that the government managing those failures has exhausted its mandate to continue? Not the military question, not the strategic question, the human question. 4 million people with nothing to drink are asking it right now. And the government that struck them silent with its own silence has no answer prepared. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you being here. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If Iran's water supply strike was designed not to degrade Israel's military capability, but to produce a civilian survival consequence, so immediate and so personal that no government communication strategy can frame it, what does the choice to strike the water rather than another military or strategic infrastructure target tell you about what Iran calculated was the remaining distance between the current political pressure on the Netanyahu government and the threshold at which that pressure produces an outcome Iran cannot achieve through military strikes alone? And at what point does a government that has gone silent about a water supply strike affecting 4 million of its own civilians exhaust the mandate its population gave it to continue this conflict? Let me know below. Subscribe and like the video if you want to stay updated on this, and click the video on screen to see another one. I will see you soon.